On my 68th birthday, as the quiet gold of the October afternoon sun settled across the salt marshes of Tidewater Lane in Charleston, South Carolina, my daughter-in-law Amberly slammed a $485,000 printed invoice onto the tablecloth, directly beside my unlit birthday cake, and shouted so the entire yard could hear, "This is the exact cost of raising a parasite for 5 long years." She demanded I sign over my oceanfront home within 7 days to settle the debt, while my own son Mason stood silently beside her, staring at the ground and nodding in passive agreement. But Amberly did not stop at a mere piece of paper. To ensure my absolute public humiliation, she had hired a professional lifestyle videographer to hover over my shoulder, panning a high-definition lens directly into my aging face to live stream my supposed panic to thousands of online viewers, carefully staging a calculated digital smear campaign to paint me as an abusive, leeching burden. Before I walk you through the rest of this afternoon, if this story has already stirred something deep within you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Dad's Ultimate Payback. Drop a comment below and let me know what city, state, or country you are watching from today. Your words carry more weight for an old man sitting on this porch than you might ever know. A quick note: some details in this narrative have been structured for storytelling and reflection, but the fundamental lesson behind it is one worth carrying with you. What Amberly, my son, and that relentless camera lens failed to realize was that the very trap they were so proudly broadcasting was about to unravel their entire lives in just a matter of hours. My name is Walter Mercer. I am 68 years old today, and 40 years of shaping heavy timber at the Charleston Naval Shipyard taught me one fundamental truth about structural integrity. A wooden ship rarely founders because of the roaring Atlantic Ocean beating against its outer hull. It sinks because tiny, invisible wood-boring worms quietly devour the heartwood from within until the beam collapses under its own weight. Human families operate under the exact same unforgiving physics. We prepare ourselves for the sudden, violent storms of life, the sudden recessions, the diagnoses, the grief, while remaining entirely blind to the slow, silent rot eating away at the timber of our own bloodline. Standing in my backyard workshop earlier that afternoon, listening to the flat gray-green tide pulling slowly back toward the horizon, I had run my left hand along the curved hull of a half-finished white oak schooner. White oak is an unyielding wood. It demands patience, sharp chisels, and weeks of quiet labor, but it holds its shape against the salt water for generations if you treat it with respect. This house on Tidewater Lane was built with that same enduring spirit. My late wife, Elaine, and I bought this property in 1987 for less than the cost of a modern work truck. For 31 years, we built our life here, one floorboard, one coat of paint, and one screened-in porch section at a time. When cancer took her 5 years ago, well-meaning neighbors suggested I sell the place, downsize, and move somewhere smaller, where a widower wouldn't have to keep up with the sea wind. I told them I would rather sand every cedar plank on this roof by hand than leave the kitchen where Elaine hung her copper measuring spoons beside the stove. The serene afternoon broke when my 10-year-old grandson, Lucas, burst into the workshop with the sudden, chaotic energy that only young boys possess, his sneakers thumping heavily against the hardwood floor. He was hiding something behind his back, his face flushed with pride, demanding I close my eyes before placing a 10-inch craft stick boat onto my workbench. The model leaned slightly to port, the mast was fashioned from toothpicks, and bright blue paint had dried in small ridges along the bow, but it was titled Grandpa's Ship in uneven black marker. As I held the tiny vessel in my left hand, Lucas pointed to my stiff, motionless right hand and asked why I never used it for delicate woodwork. I flexed the thickened, immovable knuckles of my right hand slowly, a permanent reminder of the shipyard accident 11 years ago, when a snapped steel winch cable crushed my hand 6 months before my planned retirement. The doctors called it severe traumatic arthritis. I called it the reason I spent 3 grueling years forcing my brain to learn how to write, carve, and hold a teacup exclusively with my left hand. My right hand had been completely incapable of gripping a pen, holding a tool, or forming a legible signature for over a decade. When Lucas and I walked out of the workshop to join the 30 neighbors, relatives, and lifelong friends gathered on the lawn, the atmosphere was thick with the comfortable murmur of a southern gathering. My younger sister, Ruth, pressed a cold glass of sweet tea into my palm and whispered a sharp warning that Amberly had been pacing near the fence line, making tense, hushed phone calls while Mason stood by the food table staring blankly at his untouched plate. Moments later, the screen door slapped against the house frame and Amberly stepped onto the porch. She did not wear the expression of a daughter-in-law arriving at a family birthday. She wore the sharp, predatory posture of an executive executing a hostile takeover. Trailing 2 steps behind her was a young man holding a professional camera rig mounted on a gimbal, his red recording light glowing brightly in the afternoon shade. Amberly cleared her throat, commanded the attention of the 30 guests, and walked directly to the center table where Ruth's homemade lemon cake sat waiting. With a practiced theatrical flourish designed for her live online audience, Amberly slapped the printed document flat onto the table. The header read in bold font, "Grayson Family Account, Statement of Household Expenses." It itemized 5 years of fabricated debts totaling $485,000, culminating in that cruel red line at the bottom labeling me a parasite. She turned to the crowd, projecting her voice with the polished outrage of a seasoned performer, claiming that she and Mason had financed my entire existence since Elaine's passing while I contributed nothing. She then produced the second document, a fully prepared property deed transfer, already formatted with a clean signature line at the bottom, offering me 7 days to hand over the house to settle the fictitious debt. Beside her, the videographer circled closely, angling the lens to capture my face, waiting for the trembling hands, the angry outburst, or the tearful pleading that would make perfect viral content for her social media campaign. My son Mason stood to her left, his jaw working as he ground his back teeth, a nervous habit he had carried since childhood whenever he was terrified or hiding a profound shame. He looked at me for a fraction of a second before darting his eyes away toward the grass. The neighbors sat frozen in shocked silence. Pastor Hines lowered his fork, and my sister Ruth's fingers dug tightly into my forearm. They expected me to break. They expected an old, grieving man to crumble under the weight of public humiliation, financial ruin, and the terrifying threat of losing his home. But what Amberly and my son failed to comprehend was that a man who has spent 40 years calculating structural loads does not panic when the wind begins to howl. He simply looks for the rot, checks his blueprints, and prepares to let the law do the heavy lifting. I carefully set my glass of sweet tea on the table, pushed my chair back, and looked across the spread of birthday food at my daughter-in-law and her glowing camera lens with absolute unyielding calm. The silence that descended upon the back porch of Tidewater Lane was not the quiet of a peaceful evening. It was the heavy, suffocating stillness that settles over a shipyard right before a crane cable snaps under too much tension. 30 pairs of eyes moved back and forth between Amberly's triumphant, smirking face, the glowing lens of her videographer's camera, and me. I did not raise my voice. I did not slam my glass down or yell at my son. In 40 years of repairing heavy vessels, I learned that when a hull is leaking, shouting at the water does not make the ship float. You simply trace the leak to its source and plug it. "Give me a moment," I said calmly. My voice was quiet, carry-free of anger, but it cut straight through the tense air. I pushed my chair back, stood up with the unhurried deliberation of a man who knows time is on his side, and walked through the screen door into the house. Behind me, the spring creaked, and the door slapped shut against the wooden frame. Through the mesh, I heard Amberly say to the gathered crowd with absolute, unshakable confidence, "See, he's going to his room to gather his pride. He knows he has no choice but to sign." I walked down the dark hallway to my bedroom, opened the bottom drawer of my nightstand, and reached past Elaine's old reading glasses and the framed photograph from our 25th anniversary. I pulled out 2 items, a thick navy blue ledger with worn leather corners and a sealed manila envelope. I did not rush on my way back out. That was the first miscalculation Amberly made in building her public ambush. She had designed her theatrical performance around the assumption that an old, grieving widower would return from the house rattled, defensive, and tearful, the exact kind of emotional breakdown that makes for dramatic, viral video content. Instead, I walked back through the screen door at the exact same steady pace I had left. I set the navy blue ledger and my manila envelope squarely on the table beside her $485,000 invoice, directly in front of the videographer's lens, and pulled my chair out to sit down. "Sit down, Walter," Amberly said, her smile patronizing and tight. "There is nothing in that dusty notebook that alters the financial facts I have presented to this family today." "You might be right," I said quietly, adjusting my position, "but let us find out together." By then, my attorney and oldest friend, Clifton Mercer, was already moving. Clifton had kept his laptop open on a small side table since before the party began, a detail my sister Ruth had noticed earlier without saying a word, because Clifton had asked her to keep quiet. He carried the computer over now, setting it flat on the main dining table where the guests on both sides could clearly see the screen. "What is this?" Amberly's voice sharpened, her eyes darting toward Clifton. "Who asked you to bring a computer to a private family discussion?" "I did," I replied, looking her straight in the eye. "Clifton Mercer is my legal counsel and my friend of 50 years. Where I go, his counsel goes." I unclasped the navy blue ledger and opened it to the very first page, turning the book so that Pastor Hines, the Hendersons, and my cousin Darla could read the meticulous entries. "This is the first layer of your truth, Amberly," I said, my tone as measured as a plumb line. "For 5 years, since the month after Elaine passed away, I have recorded every single household expense to the exact penny. Groceries, Property taxes, structural repairs, municipal water, electricity, even the firewood stacked beside the workshop. Every monthly entry is written in my own hand, and every receipt is taped to its corresponding page. I paused, letting the reality of the book settle over the table. I have paid my own way with my shipyard pension and my savings without missing a single payment, I continued. I have not cost you or my son a single copper cent in 5 full years. My cousin Darla adjusted her reading glasses, leaning in over the table to inspect the neat columns of figures. Lord of mercy, she whispered, her voice carrying across the quiet yard. He has every receipt dated and stamped, every single one. Amberly's rehearsed smile flickered for a fraction of a second before she forced it back into place. That is merely your personal pocket money, Walter. That does not account for the broader household burden you represent, the shared maintenance, or the sheer cost of our time spent managing your affairs. Then let us talk about the time and the annuity, Clifton interrupted. His voice carried the dry, weighty authority of a man who had spent half a century making complex legal maneuvers sound dangerously simple. Clifton rotated his laptop screen toward the crowd. Displayed on the monitor was an official, certified 5-year bank statement from Elaine's private annuity account, a specialized retirement trust she had quietly established back in 1998 long before her illness, listing our son, Mason, as the named beneficiary upon her death. Elaine Mercer established a private annuity with a guaranteed monthly distribution of $3,000, Clifton explained to the 30 silent witnesses. Upon her passing 5 years ago, those distributions transferred automatically to Mason. $3,000 a month for 60 consecutive months. That is exactly $180,000 of Elaine's hard-earned money that has flowed directly into your household account, Mrs. Mercer, since the month my friend became a widower. A collective gasp rippled through the porch. The quiet became so absolute that you could hear the distant gulls calling over the salt marsh 200 yards away. My son Mason's head dropped even lower. His face had turned the stark, sickly color of old sailcloth. Elaine did not stop taking care of this family just because she left this earth, I said softly, pressing my back teeth together until the tightness in my throat eased. She set that fund up to ensure Mason would never struggle, and to ensure this house would always be maintained. Every single month, that money went into your bank account. Amberly's face flushed a deep, angry crimson, her composure fraying at the edges. That is an entirely separate financial matter. That has nothing to do with what you owe us for the burden of living here. Then let us address what is actually owed, I said, nodding to Clifton. Clifton reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a duplicate copy of the property deed transfer, the exact same document Amberly had slid across the table 20 minutes earlier demanding my signature. He laid it flat under the glare of the patio lights and smoothed the paper with his palm. This document, Clifton began, pointing a long finger at the bottom of the page where a neat flowing signature read Walter Mercer, was submitted to a local notary as Walter Grayson Mercer's authentic, voluntary authorization to surrender his land. Clifton looked up from the paper and looked at me. I slowly raised my right hand off the table and held it out in front of the videographer's camera lens, right beside my blue ledger. The knuckles were thick, gnarled, and frozen inward like a twisted oak branch, the permanent damage from the steel winch cable that had crushed my hand at the naval yard 11 years ago. The fingers hung stiff and useless, completely incapable of closing around a pen or forming a single letter. The accident at the shipyard ended my career, I said, my voice dropping an octave into a low, metallic rasp. I have not been able to hold a pen, let alone sign my own name with this right hand, in 11 years. Every contract, every check, and every document I have signed since 2015 has been executed exclusively with my left hand. And my left hand produces a rough, blocky signature that looks nothing like this elegant script. Clifton turned the document toward Amberly, his expression turning cold as iron. In the state of South Carolina, forging another person's signature on a legal property deed, or uttering a forged instrument to fraudulently convey real estate, is a Class H felony. It carries a mandatory sentence of up to 25 months in a state penitentiary. Clifton didn't look at Amberly when he delivered the legal classification. He looked directly at my son, Mason. Mason made a low, strangled sound in the back of his throat, the sound of a man watching the ground cave in beneath his feet. His hands went to his face, his shoulders trembling as the reality of what he had allowed his wife to do finally crushed him. And there is one more detail this family deserves to know, Clifton added, clicking a button on his laptop to display a set of confidential audit records obtained through a court subpoena. The $180,000 from Elaine's annuity did not go toward household bills or Mason's future. Over the last 4 years, Amberly secretly funneled every dollar of that annuity into illegal underground gambling parlors operating across the Georgia state line. And when that money ran out, She took out an unauthorized $500,000 high-interest loan from a predatory lender named Derek Vaughn, using this forged deed as collateral. The porch exploded into a deafening roar of whispers and shock. Cousin Darla ripped her reading glasses off, staring at Amberly in utter horror. Pastor Hines leaned forward, his hands flat on the table, shaking his head in solemn judgment. Amberly stood frozen, her eyes wide with a terrifying mixture of exposed guilt and failing calculation. The lifestyle videographer lowered his camera, his hands shaking, realizing he was no longer recording a viral smear campaign against a helpless old man, but filming the live, undeniable evidence of a major felony. The roar of voices that swept across the screened porch of Tidewater Lane was not the loud, dramatic outcry of a television courtroom. It was the heavy, suffocating rumble of honest neighbors and lifelong friends realizing they were standing in the presence of an utterly calculated crime. My cousin Darla sat with her hands clamped tight over her mouth, her reading glasses dangling uselessly from one ear, while Pastor Hines stared at Amberly with an expression of quiet, righteous disgust that no sermon could ever capture. The videographer, realizing his camera was now recording a live confession to a Class H felony rather than a viral tearjerker, lowered his expensive rig until the red recording light dangled near his knees like a dying ember. Amberly's face went through 3 distinct transformations in the span of 5 seconds. First, the white-hot shock of exposure, then the frantic, darting panic of a trapped animal, and finally a cold, terrifying calcification of pure desperation. She realized the paper trail of Elaine's annuity, the navy blue ledger of my meticulous receipts, and the gnarled, useless knuckles of my crushed right hand had systematically dismantled every lie she had spent months constructing. But a predator backed into a corner by cold facts rarely surrenders with dignity. Instead, it tears down the remaining structure around it, hoping the dust and chaos will create a route for escape. With her hands shaking violently, Amberly snatched her phone off the tablecloth. Her manicured thumb tapped 3 digits with a wild, frantic speed, and before anyone at the table could fully process what she was doing, she pressed the speaker to her ear and dropped into a crouch beside my chair, her chest heaving in a performance of breathlessly manufactured terror that would have impressed a Hollywood director. "Help me, please. Send someone to 412 Tidewater Lane immediately," she gasped into the receiver, her voice pitched in a shrill, hysterical sob that echoed loudly across the silent backyard. "My father-in-law, he's having a violent, senile breakdown. He's making financial threats, he's cornered us on the porch, and he's physically aggressive. He's threatening the safety of his 10-year-old grandson right now. Please, hurry before he hurts the boy." She slammed the phone shut before the emergency dispatcher could even ask for a confirmation, throwing the device back onto the tablecloth with a triumphant, breathless glare at me. "Good Lord above," Pastor Hines whispered, his hands pressing flat against the wood as he stood up half an inch from his chair. "She just called the law on a man at his own birthday party." My sister Ruth's fingers dug into the fabric of my sleeve so hard I could feel her nails through the white oak-stained cotton of my shirt. "Walter," she hissed in my ear, her voice trembling with a mixture of raw fury and paralyzing fear. "She just filed an emergency call against you in front of 30 people. What are we going to do?" I did not move. I did not raise my voice, nor did I reach out to touch the documents on the table. In 40 years of working the naval docks, when a steel cable under extreme tension snaps and whips across the deck, you do not try to catch it with your bare hands. You stand firmly on your feet, you step behind the reinforced bulkhead, and you let the kinetic force burn itself out against the iron. "We do nothing, Ruth," I said softly, my voice as level and cool as the deep waters off the Charleston harbor. "We sit right here, we do not touch a single piece of paper on this table, and we wait." Clifton was already standing, with the slow, methodical grace of a man who had spent 50 years navigating the unyielding machinery of South Carolina law. He quietly reached over, closed his laptop screen to a narrow slit, and moved it to a small side table well out of Amberly's reach. He caught my eye across the table and gave me a single, imperceptible nod. 3 weeks ago, sitting in his sunlit office on Broad Street while our coffee grew cold between us, we had mapped out this exact contingency. Clifton had looked at me over his reading glasses and said, "Walter, if her desperation drives her past the line of filing a false report, let her cross it. Every step she takes past that line is another nail the state of South Carolina will drive into her legal coffin." 7 minutes later, the crunch of heavy tires on crushed oyster shell gravel signaled the arrival of the Charleston County Sheriff's Department. The cruiser parked near the side gate, its amber and blue lights flashing silently against the white oak trees. A single officer stepped out, Officer Reeves, a woman in her mid-30s with a sharp, observant posture and the deliberate, measured stride of a deputy who knows how to read a scene before she takes her first step into it. Her eyes swept across the 30 frozen guests, The unlit birthday cake sitting beside a mountain of legal documents, the videographer cowering by the fence, and the distinct rift that had formed between Amberly and the rest of the gathering. "Good afternoon," Officer Reeves said, her voice completely neutral, carrying the practiced authority of someone who deals in facts rather than family drama. "We received a 911 call, reporting an active domestic disturbance and a threat to a minor at this address. Who made the call?" Amberly stepped forward instantly, her posture instantly transforming back into that of a trembling, victimized mother seeking protection. "I did, officer," she said, her voice quivering with performative relief as she gestured toward me. "I am Amberly Mercer. This is my father-in-law, Walter Mercer. He has been escalating all afternoon, yelling, making financial threats, and threatening my family. Earlier this week, he was physically aggressive with my 10-year-old son, Lucas. We are terrified for the boy's safety." Officer Reeves shifted her gaze to me. "Sir, what is your name? And what is your side of what's happening here today?" I looked Officer Reeves squarely in the eyes. I did not stand up, nor did I allow a single trace of anger or panic to color my words. "My name is Walter Grayson Mercer," I stated, my tone carrying the heavy, resonant calm of an elder who knows his rights down to the bone. "This is my home, and before I answer any questions regarding these allegations or anything else that has transpired on this property today, I am formally invoking my right to remain silent and requesting the presence of my legal counsel to represent me during all questioning." I gestured with my left hand toward my oldest friend. "This is my attorney, Mr. Clifton Mercer, standing right beside me." Officer Reeves paused for a fraction of a second, a flicker of professional respect crossing her features. In the American legal system, invoking your Fifth Amendment rights and demanding an attorney immediately during a police contact creates an unyielding wall. It obligates law enforcement to stop any custodial interrogation instantly until counsel is present, ensuring that every word spoken thereafter is protected under the law. Officer Reeves recognized that she was not dealing with a confused, panicked elderly man. She was dealing with a citizen who understood the precise mechanics of legal defense. "Understood, Mr. Mercer," Officer Reeves said smoothly, turning her focus back to Amberly. "Mom, you mentioned a prior incident of physical aggression involving a minor. Do you have any physical evidence or documentation of this alleged abuse?" Amberly's eyes lit up with a cold, predatory triumph. "I do," she declared, pulling her phone back out and tapping the screen. "I captured the entire incident on video just 3 days ago right inside this house. See for yourself how he treats my son." She handed the phone to Officer Reeves. The officer held the device at eye level, watching the short 20-second video clip twice without uttering a word. From where I sat, I knew exactly what was playing on that small screen. A tightly cropped, claustrophobic video showing my face contorted in what appeared to be sudden anger. My voice raised sharply, followed by the jarring sound of 10-year-old Lucas crashing hard onto the heart pine floorboards and crying out in sudden pain. To a stranger without context, it looked like a terrifying outburst from an unstable old man. "Is the child present on the property?" Officer Reeves asked, her voice remaining entirely unreadable. "He is right here," a small, steady voice called out from the back of the porch. "My grandson, Lucas, stepped out from behind his great-aunt Ruth. He was 10 years old, wearing his Sunday shoes and a paper birthday crown that had wilted slightly in the afternoon humidity, but his shoulders were squared with a fierce, quiet stubbornness that I recognized instantly. It was the exact same stubbornness his grandmother Elaine had carried throughout her life." Officer Reeves looked down at the boy, then up at my sister. "Mom, are you a family member?" "I am his great-aunt, Ruth Mercer," my sister replied, drawing herself up to her full height. "Mercer, I need to take a brief statement from the minor," Officer Reeves said, adhering strictly to standard child welfare protocol. "Standard procedure requires that we interview minors separately from the primary parties to ensure an uninfluenced account. Would you sit with him inside while I speak to him?" "I certainly will," Ruth said, taking Lucas gently by the hand. As the boy walked toward the screen door, he turned his head and looked back at me over his shoulder. His jaw was set, his dark eyes burning with a fierce, unyielding intensity that spoke louder than any words. He gave my left hand a quick, firm nod, the nod of a young mate letting the captain know he was holding his post, before disappearing inside with my sister. Officer Reeves turned back to the dining table, her eyes falling upon the mountain of evidence spread across the white linen. The $485,000 invoice, the navy blue ledger of receipts, the forged property deed, and Clifton's laptop resting quietly on the side table. "There is a considerable amount of conflicting information here, Mr. Mercer," Officer Reeves observed, addressing Clifton. "There is indeed, officer," Clifton replied smoothly, stepping forward and opening his laptop lid just enough to illuminate the screen. "And before you proceed any further with Mrs. Mercer's allegations, there is something critical you need to examine." What Mrs. Mercer just showed you was a carefully altered, tightly cropped recording taken on her mobile phone. What she does not know is that this house is equipped with a wide-angle, motion-activated interior security camera mounted near the ceiling of the living room, installed by Walter 2 years ago after a series of break-ins on Tidewater Lane. Amberly's head snapped toward Clifton so fast her gold earrings clattered against her neck. The color instantly drained from her cheeks, leaving her face a stark, chalky gray. It records continuously to a secure cloud server, Clifton continued, turning the laptop screen toward Officer Reeves and pressing play. Same date, same timestamp, down to the exact second as Mrs. Mercer's video. But this view tells the complete unedited truth of what happened in that room. Officer Reeves leaned down, her eyes locking onto the high-definition footage. Pastor Hines, my cousin Darla, and the Hendersons pressed forward instinctively, drawn toward the glowing screen like men watching a ship navigate a narrow channel in a fog. The video played in crystal clear quality. On the screen, 10-year-old Lucas could be seen running across the living room with a leather soccer ball, cutting dangerously close to the wooden display stand, holding my half-finished white oak schooner model. The delicate boat rocked violently on its base, threatening to shatter on the floorboards. On the recording, my voice boomed out, not in anger, but in sharp, desperate alarm. "Lucas, stop right there. Watch the ship, son. Take that ball outside right now, do you hear me?" Lucas had skidded to a halt, startled, realizing he had almost destroyed 3 weeks of my labor. He turned toward the back door, calling out a quick, apologetic, "Sorry, Grandpa," over his shoulder. "Now, Officer Reeves, pay very close attention to the bottom left corner of the frame," Clifton pointed out softly, rewinding the footage 5 seconds. "Watch behind the cracked hallway door." The video replayed. There, partially concealed in the shadow behind the open hallway door, stood Amberly. She was holding her smartphone horizontally at eye level, deliberately cropping out the soccer ball, cropping out the fragile boat model, and cropping out the first half of my warning cry. Then, as Lucas turned to run outside, the wide-angle camera caught a chilling, undeniable detail. Amberly's left leg extended deliberately out from behind the doorframe, her foot sweeping sideways in a quick, practiced motion directly into the boy's path. Lucas tripped violently over her extended leg, crashing hard onto his knees and elbows against the pine floor. As the boy hit the wood, the camera's high-fidelity microphone captured a moment that made every single person on that porch freeze in absolute horror. Just a microsecond before his knees hit the floor, as Amberly's foot clipped his ankle, 10-year-old Lucas turned his head toward the crack in the door. The wide-angle lens caught the boy's face in sharp focus, his teeth grinding together in defiance, tears of pain springing to his eyes, as he leaned toward his mother and whispered in a sharp, fiercely protective hiss that cut through the quiet room. "You can try to hurt me all you want, Amberly, but you are never, ever going to steal my grandpa's house." The recording showed Amberly instantly drawing her foot back into the hallway, raising her phone to record his tears, completely ignoring the boy's whispered defiance as she captured her staged footage of his fall. The silence that followed on that porch was vast, cold, and absolute. Pastor Hines closed his eyes and bowed his head, his lips moving in a silent prayer of profound sorrow. Cousin Darla let out a choked, horrified sob, covering her face with both hands. My son Mason stood frozen beside his wife, staring at the laptop screen with an expression of such total, catastrophic realization that he looked like a man standing amid the smoking ruins of his entire life. Officer Reeves straightened up very slowly. The professional neutrality in her eyes had vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp, lethal authority. She turned her body completely away from me and faced Amberly directly. "Mrs. Mercer," Officer Reeves said, her voice dropping into an octave that carried the unyielding weight of the South Carolina Penal Code. "Filing a materially false police report is a criminal offense under state law. Attempting to manufacture false evidence to frame an individual for domestic abuse is a felony charge. And deliberately tripping a 10-year-old child to cause physical injury and fabricate a crime, that constitutes felony child endangerment." Officer Reeves reached down to her utility belt, her thumb unclipping the leather strap of her handcuffs with a sharp, metallic snap that echoed across the quiet yard. "I need you to turn around and place your hands behind your back right now," the officer commanded. "You are under arrest." The sharp, metallic click of Officer Reeves's leather handcuff strap unbuckling echoed across the screened porch of Tidewater Lane like a hammer hitting a rusty spike on an old dock. Amberly stood paralyzed, her manicured fingers trembling violently as the color drained completely from her face, leaving behind the hollow gray mask of a predator that had finally backed itself into an inescapable corner. The 30 guests gathered in my backyard remained frozen in absolute silence, the air thick with the heavy, salt-tainted humidity of a Charleston autumn, their eyes moving back and forth between the high-definition security footage playing on Clifton's laptop and the woman who had just been exposed as a monster in front of her own family. My son Mason stood 2 steps away from her, his hands hanging limp at his sides, staring at his wife with an expression so vacant, so shattered, that he looked like a man who had suddenly woken up inside the smoldering ruins of a home he had spent 7 years trying to build. Before Officer Reeves could step forward to enforce the arrest, the sharp, shrill ring of Amberly's phone broke through the stillness. The device sat flat on the white linen tablecloth, directly beside my navy blue ledger and the forged property deed, its screen flashing with an unlisted number from a regional area code. Because Amberly had activated the speakerphone function minutes earlier during her frantic performative call to the 911 dispatcher, the incoming call connected automatically on the third ring, amplifying the caller's voice across the quiet porch with brutal, unedited clarity. "Amberly, pick up the damn phone." A rough, gravelly voice barked through the small speaker, laced with the impatient, dangerous arrogance of a man who is used to giving orders in dark rooms. "What the hell is taking so long over there? Did you get the old man to sign the deed or not?" The entire porch went so still you could hear the low, rhythmic pull of the Atlantic tide dragging across the marsh grass 200 yards away. Pastor Hines gripped the edge of his chair until his knuckles turned ash white. Officer Reeves held her position, her hand resting motionless on her belt, her sharp eyes locking onto the blinking phone screen as she allowed the recording to proceed. "Listen to me, you useless bitch," the voice rasped, entirely unaware that 30 silent witnesses and a Charleston County Sheriff's deputy were listening to every syllable. "I set your pathetic husband up with that $500,000 gambling debt at the waterfront club exactly the way you planned it. You told me 10 days ago that once Mason was drowning in those marker notes, you'd use his panic to force old Walter into transferring the Tidewater property to clear the family name. I've got buyers waiting for that oceanfront lot, and my patience is gone. Do you have the signed deed? Or do I need to send my boys down to Charleston to collect from Mason the hard way?" The silence that followed was vast, freezing, and absolute. Amberly made a small, choked sound in the back of her throat, her hand lunging forward toward the table in a desperate attempt to snatch the phone and kill the call. But Officer Reeves moved with the swift, practiced authority of a seasoned law enforcement officer, stepping forward and placing one heavy, gloved hand flat on the tablecloth right beside the device. "Nobody touches that phone," Officer Reeves said softly, her voice carrying an edge of iron that froze Amberly in her tracks. From her utility vest, Officer Reeves drew a small digital recorder, activated the microphone, and set it directly beside Amberly's phone, recording the ongoing audio stream for the official police record. On the other end of the line, the caller let out a bitter, dismissive laugh, oblivious to the trap closing around him. "Amberly, are you there? Don't play games with me." The voice growled before the line abruptly went dead, leaving behind a hollow digital dial tone that echoed across the porch like a bell tolling for a funeral. Mason took one slow, agonizing step toward the table, his knees buckling slightly beneath him. He looked at the phone, then slowly raised his eyes to meet his wife's panicked gaze. His voice, when it finally broke through his throat, was hollow, raw, and cracked down the middle like dry pine exposed to the salt wind. $500,000, Mason whispered, his chest heaving as tears finally spilled over his lashes. You set me up? You made me believe I had lost everything on those cards. You made me stand here on my father's birthday and demand his home because of a debt you engineered?" Amberly's mouth opened, her mind desperately scrambling to assemble a new lie, a new facade of victimhood, but no words came out. The polished, manipulative rhythm she had used for 7 years to control my son had been utterly pulverized beneath the weight of her own recorded words. "You knew?" Mason choked out, burying his face in his hands as a dry, tearing sob shook his shoulders. "You knew what it would do to my father. You knew what it would do to Lucas. You did this to us on purpose." I sat in my wooden armchair, my hands resting quietly on my knees. I did not yell at my daughter-in-law, nor did I offer a dramatic speech to the neighbors who had gathered to celebrate my 68th birthday. When you have spent 40 years as a shipwright calculating structural loads and inspecting white oak timber, you learn that when a rotting beam finally snaps under its own weight, you do not curse the wood. You simply clear the debris and prepare to rebuild the deck on solid ground. I reached into the left breast pocket of my faded work shirt and pulled out a heavy, scuffed black flip phone, an ancient device with a cracked plastic screen and physical rubber buttons that my grandson Lucas often made fun of whenever he saw me using it. I laid the phone flat on the table right beside the navy blue ledger of my receipts. "That voice on the speaker belonged to Derek Vaughn," I said softly, my tone carrying the low, unhurried resonance of a man who had already seen the end of this storm 3 weeks before it reached my shore. "He runs an illegal sports betting and high-stakes poker parlor out of a warehouse down near the commercial docks. He is the man who has been trying to force a speculative real estate buyout on Tidewater Lane for over a year." I looked across the table at Officer Reeves, whose expression had hardened into an unyielding mask of professional focus. 3 weeks ago, I continued, I noticed Mason was coming home late from the docks, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion, his hands shaking whenever he picked up his coffee cup. I have lived long enough to know the difference between the tiredness that comes from honest labor and the hollow terror of a man who feels a rope tightening around his neck. I knew he was in trouble, but I also knew my son is not a gambler by nature. He inherits his mother's steady blood. A man doesn't suddenly accumulate $500,000 in card debts overnight unless someone is actively steering him into deep water. I adjusted my position in the chair, my stiff, crushed right hand resting motionless on the wood while my left thumb flipped open the cover of the old phone. So I did what any father who built ships for 40 years would do, I said quietly. I didn't confront Mason because I knew he was too ashamed to speak the truth. Instead, I walked down to the waterfront coffee shop on East Bay Street where Derek Vaughn holds his morning meetings. I sat down at his table alone, without a weapon, without an escort, and I bought him a cup of black coffee. My sister Ruth gasped, her hand clutching her chest as she stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. Walter, you went to see that criminal by yourself? I was never alone, Ruth, I replied gently, casting a brief glance at Clifton. Clifton was sitting in his Buick half a block away, logged into an open audio connection through an earpiece in my ear, recording every second of the conversation directly to his law firm's secure server. Under the statutes of South Carolina law, our state is a one-party consent jurisdiction regarding audio recordings, so long as one party to the conversation consents to the recording, and I explicitly consented. The audio is entirely legal and fully admissible as evidence in a court of law. I pressed a single button on the keypad of the flip phone. The small speaker crackled to life, playing a clear, uncompressed digital recording that filled the quiet porch. The ambient noise of a busy waterfront cafe faded in, followed by the low, gravelly rasp of Derek Vaughn's voice, speaking with the casual, dangerous confidence of a man who believed an old retiree was an easy target for extortion. Your boy is in deep, Walter, Vaughn's recorded voice sneered through the speaker. $500,000 in marker debts. That's not the kind of money a shipyard worker walks away from. If he doesn't pay, he goes to prison, or worse. I understand the situation, Derek, my own recorded voice answered on the tape, sounding deliberate, slow, and weary. The exact voice of a desperate, defeated father seeking a way out. That is why I am here. I want to know how a sensible boy like Mason ended up owing you that kind of money in less than 2 months. A cold, arrogant chuckle echoed from the phone speaker as Vaughn took a sip of his coffee. He didn't do it alone, old man, Vaughn bragged on the recording, his words dripping with malicious satisfaction. You can thank your darling daughter-in-law, Amberly, for the setup. She came to my office 6 months ago with a proposition. She said Mason was too soft, too loyal to you, and that the only way she'd ever get her hands on that oceanfront deed to Tidewater Lane was if Mason was facing total financial ruin. The guests on the porch held their breath, no one daring to move as the recording played on, laying bare the absolute depth of the conspiracy. She was the one who gave him the VIP access to my private table. Vaughn's voice continued on the tape, his tone matter-of-fact and devoid of any human empathy. And when Mason tried to walk away after losing his first $10,000, Amberly made sure his drink was spiked with a heavy sedative during a private dinner at her house. He was half-conscious when he signed those $500,000 marker notes at my club. She even used her own son, the 10-year-old boy, as emotional collateral, telling Mason that if he didn't clear the debt by getting your house, she'd take the kid and leave him destitute. The tape reached its end with a soft digital beep, leaving behind a silence so dense, so heavy, that the crushing weight of it seemed to bend the very floorboards of the porch. Mason dropped to his knees right there on the wooden deck beside the table. He did not look at his wife. He did not look at the neighbors. He simply pressed his forehead against the cool pine wood, his shoulders heaving in silent, agonizing convulsions of grief and relief as the monstrous illusion he had lived under for 7 years finally shattered into dust. Pastor Hines stood up slowly from his seat, his tall frame towering over the table as he looked down at Amberly with an expression of profound, righteous condemnation. "May God have mercy on your soul, woman," the pastor whispered softly, "for what you have tried to do to this house." Officer Reeves did not wait another second. She stepped around the table, grabbed Amberly's wrist, and brought her arm firmly behind her back, snapping the cold steel handcuff around her wrist with a definitive, metallic click. "Amberly Mercer," Officer Reeves stated, her voice cold, precise, and completely devoid of warmth as she recited the mandatory constitutional warnings. "You are under arrest for felony child endangerment, criminal conspiracy, filing a false police report, and solicitation to commit wire and mortgage fraud. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. As the officer led the trembling, silent woman down the porch steps toward the waiting cruiser, I remained seated in my wooden chair. I looked at the old black flip phone resting on the table, then looked out toward the quiet waters of the marsh where the afternoon sun was finally beginning its slow descent below the tree line. I felt no surges of wild triumph, no burning thrill of revenge. I felt only the deep, quiet peace of a man who had spent his life building structures strong enough to withstand the storm, knowing that when the rot is finally carved out of the timber, the house still stands. The click of the cruiser door closing behind Amberly cut through the autumn air of Tidewater Lane like a heavy iron gate latching shut, leaving behind a silence on the screened porch so dense that you could hear the low, rhythmic pull of the Atlantic tide dragging through the marsh grass 200 yards away. The 30 neighbors, relatives, and lifelong friends gathered under the white oak trees stood paralyzed, their faces etched with a mixture of profound shock and quiet, solemn relief. My son, Mason, remained on his knees beside the long dining table, his hands pressed flat against the cool pine floorboards, his shoulders shaking with the silent, dry heaves of a man who had suddenly surfaced from deep underwater, only to find his entire world dissolved into ash. I did not move from my wooden armchair. I sat quietly with my left hand resting flat over the worn leather cover of my navy blue ledger, my stiff, crushed right hand resting motionless beside it like a piece of drift timber washed ashore after a brutal storm. In 40 years of repairing heavy vessels at the naval docks, I had seen giant steel hulls buckle under immense pressure, but the most dangerous structural failures were always the ones that occurred quietly beneath the waterline, hidden away until the entire framework collapsed inward. Clifton Mercer stepped slowly toward the head of the table. He did not rush, nor did he offer any dramatic flourish. With the unhurried, measured dignity of a man who had spent half a century handling the solemn legal affairs of coastal South Carolina families, he reached into his leather briefcase, pulled out a thick document encased in a crisp blue legal cover, and laid it flat under the warm glow of the patio lights. "There is one final document that needs to be entered into the record this evening," Clifton said, his deep, gravelly voice carrying cleanly across the quiet porch. "A document that renders every scheme, every forged deed, and every fraudulent debt concocted by Amberly and her associates entirely void from the very beginning." He unclasped the brass fastener and opened the first page, his long fingers tracing the clean, dark ink of the text. "This is the last will and testament of Elaine Margaret Mercer," Clifton declared to the silent assembly, his tone measured and clear. "Drawn up, signed, and legally executed 14 months prior to her passing, witnessed by 2 independent attorneys and notarized in the city of Charleston. I am the designated sole executor of this estate." At the sound of his mother's name, Mason's head came up slowly. His eyes were red, swollen, and raw, the skin around them blotched with the agonizing shame of a son who had stood beside an executioner on his father's 68th birthday. Clifton adjusted his reading glasses and read directly from the flagged paragraph on page 4. "All real property held in the name of Elaine Margaret Mercer and Walter Grayson Mercer, including the land, workshop, and residential structure located at 412 Tidewater Lane, Charleston, South Carolina, shall pass in full to my beloved husband, Walter Grayson Mercer, upon my death, to be held by him as a life estate for the duration of his natural life. Upon the eventual passing of my husband, the remainder interest shall pass to our son, Mason Edward Mercer, subject to one strict, non-negotiable protective condition." Clifton paused, taking a slow breath as he looked up over the top of his glasses at Mason kneeling on the floor. "That said remainder beneficiary, Mason Edward Mercer, shall at all times demonstrate consistent filial respect, care, and protection toward his father, Walter Grayson Mercer. Should Mason Edward Mercer engage in any act of fraud, coercion, legal displacement, or material harm against his father, or attempt to encumber or seize the property at 412 Tidewater Lane during his father's lifetime, his remainder interest shall be instantly and automatically forfeited in its entirety. Upon such forfeiture, the full title shall immediately transfer to the Charleston Maritime Heritage Foundation to preserve the land as a permanent historic preserve." The words hung in the salt air like a heavy, unyielding anchor dropping to the ocean floor. Mason stared at the blue legal cover, his lips parting, but no sound came out. The house had never been available for Amberly to steal. Elaine had foreseen the storm 9 years ago. She had recognized the subtle, creeping rot long before I ever dared to admit it to myself. And with the quiet, razor-sharp brilliance that defined her entire life, she had built an indestructible legal seawall around my golden years before drawing her final breath. She knew. Mason whispered, his voice cracking down the middle like dry pine exposed to the sun. Mom knew. She saw what I was becoming. She saw how weak I was. I looked down at my son, the boy I had taught to haul crab pots in the creek, the young man whose college tuition I had paid with the overtime sweat of my shipyard shifts. The anger that had burned quietly in my chest during the ambush had vanished, replaced by a deep, aching sorrow for the man kneeling in the ruins of his own foolishness. "Your mother was the smartest person who ever walked through that kitchen door, Mason," I said softly, my voice carrying the low, calm resonance of an old oak beam. "She didn't write that clause out of malice. She wrote it because she loved you with her eyes wide open. She knew that a man who doesn't guard his own house will eventually let the wolves inside, and she made sure that even if you lost your way, you wouldn't be able to tear down the roof that sheltered your father." Before Mason could answer, the radio mounted on Officer Reeves's shoulder crackled to life with a sharp burst of static, cutting through the emotional weight of the porch. A flat, professional voice from the dispatch center echoed loudly through the speaker. "Deputy Reeves, Unit 41 is on scene at East Bay and Chapel Street. Suspect Derek Vaughn has been taken into custody without incident based on the wiretap and conspiracy warrant. Be advised, suspect made an unprovoked voluntary statement during transport regarding the minor at your location." Officer Reeves unclipped the radio, pressing the button with a firm thumb. "Go ahead, dispatch. What is the statement?" The radio static hissed briefly before the dispatcher's voice returned, cold, precise, and devoid of any human warmth. "Suspect Vaughn claimed on record that the 10-year-old minor, Lucas Mercer, is his biological child, alleging an affair with Amberly Mercer dating back 11 years. Suspect states he has paternity documentation stored at his residence and demanded visitation rights." The silence that followed was far worse than the noise of Amberly's arrest. It was a dark, suffocating abyss that seemed to swallow every bit of air on that porch. Cousin Darla gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Pastor Hines closed his eyes, his tall frame rigid as he offered a silent prayer into the evening quiet. Mason didn't scream. He didn't rise to punch the wall. Instead, he made a sound that I had never heard come from a full-grown man. A low, broken whimpering sound, like an animal caught in an iron trap. The final, brutal piece of Amberly's deceit had landed squarely on his chest, crushing whatever remaining dignity he had tried to hold on to. His entire life, his marriage, his financial standing, his identity as a father, had been systematically constructed on a foundation of absolute falsehoods. He slumped forward, his forehead pressing against the cold wood, his hands clawing at the floorboards as dry, violent sobs tore through his chest. Then the screen door swung open. 10-year-old Lucas stepped out onto the porch. He had finished his statement with the deputy inside, his paper birthday crown still clinging lopsidedly to his dark hair. He stood near the doorway for a second, taking in the scene. The legal papers spread across the table, the blue light still flashing beyond the fence, and his father kneeling on the floor, broken and weeping in front of 30 neighbors. The boy didn't hesitate. He didn't ask about the radio call, nor did he look at the police cruiser down the driveway. He walked across the wooden deck with steady, deliberate steps, his Sunday shoes clicking firmly against the pine, until he reached his father. Lucas dropped to his knees right in front of Mason. He reached out his small hands and grabbed his father's work-ruined face, forcing Mason to lift his head and look into his eyes. "Dad," the 10-year-old boy said, his voice trembling slightly, but carrying a fierce, unshakable clarity that pierced through the dark stillness of the evening. "Look at me, Dad." Mason tried to pull away, tears streaming down his face, his voice choked with raw, suffocating shame. "Lucas, oh God, Lucas, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." "Listen to me," Lucas demanded, his fingers tightening against his father's cheeks, his dark eyes burning with an intensity that belonged to a grown man. "I don't care what that man on the radio said. I don't care about DNA, and I don't care about any paper in a courthouse. You were the one who built my bike. You were the one who sat in the chair beside my bed every single night when I had the croup and couldn't breathe. You were my dad, do you hear me? You were my dad, and nobody can ever change that." Mason froze. He looked at the 10-year-old boy holding his face, the child he had raised, the child he had walked to the school bus every morning, the child who carried the exact same stubborn, fierce loyalty that Elaine had passed down through our bloodline. With a ragged, breathless cry, Mason threw his arms around the boy's shoulders, pulling Lucas tight against his chest, burying his face in the child's neck as he wept openly. Without shame, without pretense, shedding 7 years of toxic manipulation and deceit in the arms of the son who loved him unconditionally. I sat in my armchair, watching the two of them held tight in that embrace under the fading autumn light. I felt the tightness behind my eyes that I had held back all afternoon finally loosen, a single warm tear tracing a slow path down the deep, weathered grooves of my left cheek. A man spends 40 years learning how to join white oak beams so that a ship can survive the crushing force of the open ocean. But sitting on that porch on my 68th birthday, looking at my son and my grandson holding each other amid the wreckage of a shattered lie, I realized that the strongest timber ever grown on this earth is not white oak or steel. It is the quiet, unyielding grace of a family that refuses to let the rot win, a family that stands firm on the truth no matter how violently the storm rages around them. The first light of dawn over Tidewater Lane does not burst open with grand theatricality. It arrives slowly, a soft, pale silver spreading flat across the salt marshes of Charleston, smoothing the gray-green waters of the Atlantic until the line between the sea and the sky dissolves entirely into a quiet, seamless horizon. By 6 o'clock on the morning after my 68th birthday, the flashing blue and amber lights of the sheriff's department had long vanished. The 30 neighbors and friends had quietly returned to their homes, and the heavy, suffocating storm that had threatened to tear my life apart had finally burned itself out against the unyielding bedrock of the truth. Standing on the screened back porch with a steaming ceramic mug of black coffee held firmly in my left hand, I watched the morning tide begin its slow, eternal pullback toward the open ocean. The air smelled of salt, pine resin, and the sharp, clean ozone that always lingers in the low country after a dark cloud passes overhead. Later that morning, the cold, unyielding machinery of the American legal system began its formal work, not with dramatic speeches or emotional outbursts, but with the quiet, devastating efficiency of filed indictments and recorded evidence. Clifton Mercer called my landline at precisely 8:15 to deliver the official update from the Charleston County Judicial Center. Amberly and her associate, Derek Vaughn, were not merely facing minor local charges. The airtight evidence package we had assembled had triggered a cascading avalanche of criminal indictments that no high-priced defense attorney could ever hope to dismantle. Amberly had been formally arraigned on felony counts of filing a false police report, felony child endangerment for her calculated physical sabotage of 10-year-old Lucas, and Class H felony deed forgery for uttering a fraudulent real estate document bearing a forged right-handed signature I had been physically incapable of producing for over a decade. Furthermore, because her fraudulent communications and extortion schemes crossed state lines into Georgia and utilized interstate electronic banking networks to siphon away Elaine's annuity distributions, federal prosecutors from the district court had stepped in, adding federal wire fraud and mortgage fraud conspiracy to her indictment sheet. Derek Vaughn fared no better. The wiretap recording I had secured during our waterfront meeting, paired with the automated audio captured on Amberly's speakerphone in front of Deputy Reeves and 30 witnesses, had given federal authorities everything required to dismantle his illegal sports betting ring and predatory loan sharking operation along the commercial docks. He was remanded without bail to the Charleston County Detention Center, facing a litany of federal racketeering, illegal gambling enterprise, and wire fraud charges. As Clifton carefully detailed the legal mechanics over the receiver, I listened in quiet silence, feeling no surges of vengeful malice, no fiery thrill of triumph. When a shipwright uses a sharp chisel to carve away a patch of dry rot from a white oak timber, he does not hate the decayed wood. He simply removes it cleanly so that the beam can hold the weight of the deck once more. Justice, when executed properly, is not an act of passionate rage. It is merely the cold, mathematical restoration of structural balance. At 9 in the morning, the crunch of hesitant footsteps on the crushed oyster shell driveway drew my eyes toward the back door. I opened the wooden frame and stepped out onto the porch. Standing at the bottom of the steps was my son, Mason. He looked as though he had walked through a war zone. His eyes were bloodshot, sunken deep into dark, bruised sockets, his jaw covered in a rough, uneven stubble. Wearing the same wrinkled, salt-stained work shirt he had worn during the ambush the previous afternoon. His hands were buried deep inside his pockets, his shoulders curved inward as if he were trying to make his large frame as small and invisible as possible. He stood on the gravel, staring at his boots, paralyzed by the overwhelming, crushing weight of a shame so profound that he could not bring himself to lift his eyes and face the man whose home he had almost helped destroy. For a long, heavy minute, neither of us spoke. The only sound between us was the soft rustle of the coastal wind through the sprawling branches of the magnolia tree Elaine had planted in the side yard back in 1991, a tree that now stood taller than the roofline of our home. I looked at my son, the boy I had held in my arms when he was born, the young man whose knuckles I had wiped clean when he learned to handle a chisel in my workshop, the father who had just been shattered and rebuilt by the fierce love of his 10-year-old boy the night before. I don't expect you to forgive me, Dad, Mason whispered, his voice cracking, hollow and stripped of all pretense, his words barely carrying over the breeze. I stood on this porch. I let her put that paper on your table. I listened to her call you a parasite, and I didn't stop it. I don't have any right to stand on your land. I needed to tell you that I'm sorry. Every second of the rest of my life I will be sorry. He turned slowly to walk away, his head bowed, preparing to carry his exile into the cold world. I took a slow step forward to the edge of the porch, resting my left hand against the sturdy wooden railing. Mason, I called out. My voice was low, deep and steady, not shouting but carrying the quiet, unyielding authority of a father who knows the difference between a broken beam and a ruined foundation. Mason froze. He turned his head slowly, his eyes wide, wet and terrified. I gestured with my chin toward the open kitchen door, where the warm smell of brewing chicory coffee drifted out into the morning air. "The coffee is hot," I said softly, my tone devoid of anger, carrying only the simple, profound weight of an open door. "Come inside, son." Mason stood frozen on the gravel for 3 long seconds, his chest heaving before a choked, silent sob broke from his throat. He climbed the wooden steps with slow, trembling strides, wiped his face with the back of his sleeve, and crossed the threshold back into his mother's house. Inside the sunlit kitchen, 10-year-old Lucas was already sitting at the oak dining table, dressed in his school shirt, his hair combed straight. Beside his elbow sat his homemade craft stick boat, Grandpa's ship, resting proudly on the placemat. When Mason walked in, the boy did not flinch, nor did he ask about lawyers, police, or DNA. He simply looked up at his father, offered that wide, gap-toothed smile that always made something ache behind my sternum, and pulled out the chair beside him. "Hey, Dad," Lucas said smoothly, as if the sun had simply risen on another ordinary Saturday morning. "Grandpa made biscuits. They're a little dry, but if you dunk them in the coffee, they're okay." Mason dropped into the chair, pulled his son tight against his side with one heavy arm, and buried his face in the boy's dark hair for a brief, quiet moment before regaining his composure. I walked over to the counter, picked up the round glass plate holding the lemon cake my sister Ruth had baked, and carried it to the center of the table. The white wax candles were still stuck into the yellow frosting, unlit from the chaotic ambush of the previous afternoon. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a box of wooden strike anywhere matches, and lit every single candle one by one until 6 small gold flames danced in the morning light coming through the window. I set the cake down right beside the framed photograph of Elaine that always sat by the sugar bowl. The picture taken on this exact porch back in 1994, her dark hair blown sideways by an autumn wind, laughing at something just outside the frame. "Make a wish, Grandpa," Lucas whispered, his dark eyes reflecting the small, warm flames. I looked at my late wife's laughing eyes in the photograph. I looked at my son, sitting straight in his chair, holding his boy's hand with a firm, protective grip that no lie on earth could ever sever. I looked down at my own left hand, resting steady and strong on the edge of the oak table beside my navy blue ledger. "I don't need to make a wish, Lucas," I said softly, my voice carrying the deep, quiet peace of a man who has brought his vessel safely through the worst storm of his life. "Everything I ever cared about saving is sitting right at this table." I leaned forward and blew out the candles. Every single one. People often ask me, in the quiet conversations that happen on hardware store porches or along the boat docks of Charleston, if I feel like I achieved some grand dramatic revenge against the people who tried to destroy me. I always shake my head and look out at the water. I do not view my life through the narrow lens of vengeance. I think about Elaine. I think about what she used to tell me when the tides were rough and the shipyard work was heavy. "Walter, God doesn't give a man more than he can carry. He just makes sure you know exactly what you're carrying." I believed that when I was a young man shaping timber in the docks, and I believe it with every fiber of my being today. Real family justice does not come from screaming matches, violent confrontations, or burning down the house to spite the rats inside. It comes from patience. It comes from keeping your books balanced, your receipts filed, and your mind razor sharp while the foolish and the greedy trap themselves in the webs of their own deceit. I was a revenge dad the slow, quiet way. Not with anger, not with threats, but with time, preparation, and the unyielding legal armor built by a wife who loved her family enough to protect us from our own worst blind spots. If you ever find yourself standing where I stood, ambushed on your own porch, written off as an inconvenient burden by the very people you bled for, do not react from rage. Rage is a weak, chaotic material that fractures under load. Be the kind of defender who keeps his ledgers, knows his blueprints, and lets the cold, unvarnished truth do the heavy lifting. Do not wait until your birthday table becomes a courtroom. Protect what matters before someone else tries to take it from you. If this story spoke to your heart today, if it reminded you of the enduring strength required to guard your home and your dignity, please take a moment right now to hit the like button and subscribe to Dad's Ultimate Payback. Leave a comment below and tell me, what would you have done if you were standing in my shoes on that porch? Share this video with a friend, a brother, or a fellow father who needs to hear this lesson today. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. Stand firm, keep your ledgers clean, and never let anyone make you feel like a guest in the home you built with your own 2 hands.